1 minute's up. We're into Cold War Part 2, folks, all right? And again, Regents concept-based lecture. We're shooting for multiple choice and explaining kind of thematic ideas and concepts for the United States History Regents exam in New York State. And we just finished up talking about the beginning roots of the Cold War. Vocabulary included terms like Yalta, the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, the Berlin Airlift, NATO, Warsaw Pact, collective security, MAD, mutual assured destruction, brinkmanship. So we did cover a lot in that last lecture. But we're ready to kind of move on, and I'm trying to think in my head where we should start. And I guess we should kind of approach it through the 1950s. Let's do Korean conflict, and then we'll do, I guess, Cuban Missile Crisis, and we'll see where we are there. But Korea is something that does pop up on the test in multiple choice. Korea, small southeastern, Asian country that also had two spheres of influence in the Cold War. Basically, the Soviets, I don't want to say control, but had influence over North Korea, and America had control with their allied powers in South Korea. So basically what happens, it's a little bit of a complicated story, and I'm not like a Korean War expert, but I know the Regents' answers. Number one, it's an episode of containment. What's going to happen is South Korea and North Korea, at least North Korea, wants to reunite with South Korea. And when elections didn't happen, and I think they thought elections were going to happen, that these two countries were going to come together. Now, we talked about where communism is attractive. Do you think that Korea is more like, Manhattan, Park Avenue, or more like, a poor, developing nation? Obviously it's poorer. So I think, communism, bred there because there was a lot of farmers and rural poverty and, promises of equality and land and peace and bread were attractive. The United States policy, however, is containment. So we weren't about to let that happen. So after elections didn't happen, eventually the North Koreans, they started it, invaded South Korea. I don't think to kill all the South Koreans, but definitely to change and unite the government into one communist country. So one of the answers on the test relates to containment, but another one relates to the United Nations. And just to backtrack a little bit, the United Nations was formed kind of like League of Nations Part 2 at the end of World War II, and the United States is going to fully embrace this. In fact, the headquarters is in New York, and we're really going to have a large role now in the world. So, man, this is complicated. In the United Nations, there are certain countries that are on a Security Council, kind of like the most important group of people, countries that get to kind of decide big issues. And I think all countries have an opportunity to be there for a little while. But there's 5 countries, at least back then, and I think today, that are on the Permanent Security Council. And if I get this wrong, I'm going to look like an idiot. But we're one of them. China is one of them. England is one of them. I'm going to say France, and definitely Russia, the Soviet Union. So those 5 countries have what's called veto power. They have the ability to basically stop the United Nations from taking action. And because the world is split into red and not red, really, the United Nations is kind of like a paper tiger. It's kind of like, oh, look at my sharp teeth. I have UN force. I can bite you. But, the guys holding my collar can stop me whenever they want. So I can't really bite you. So one of the questions on the test that you have to know is that Korea is not a war. It is a United Nations conflict. But Mr. Hughes, you just told us it was a paper tiger. It gets a little complicated, and basically it revolves around China. In the early 1950s, China went red, and we couldn't stop it. A lot of people blame Truman. A lot of people wanted to nuke China, including Douglas MacArthur. But that's a failure of containment, China going red. Now, since we had great influence on the United Nations, when this event occurred, we refused this new Chinese communist country entry into the United Nations. We said, no, we're recognizing the Chiang Kai-shek. I probably messed that up too. But we're not going to recognize this new communist government. So the Soviet Union was like, well, if you're not going to recognize them, then I'm walking away. They're not there. China, the Soviet Union, these countries on that Permanent Security Council, they're not there. That's when the United States steps in, uses its influence and its power in the United Nations, and its power on the Security Council without the Reds there to take UN command into Korea. So technically, Korean War is a United Nations conflict. Remember, constitutional stuff. Congress declares war. It's only Congress that can do that. Congress never declared war. So we start sending our GIs into South Korea. And remember, what's the objective? You're saying it now. I'm so proud of you. Containment. So it's not to conquer North Korea, but rather to get them back over the border. That border is called the 38th parallel. And the 38th parallel is important because today it's still a guarded border. We still have Americans near that border waiting for the North Koreans to run over. But there are some really easy questions you can get right when we go into the Battle of Korea. And again, we're not a war class, but there is a question regarding Douglas MacArthur, the hero of World War II, the author of the Japanese Constitution, a very historical, heroic, famous American. And he was the commander of the United Nations forces. It's an American force, but I gotta say UN. The UN forces in South Korea. And basically, his orders under Harry Truman were to fight the communists back to the 38th parallel. And what happened was, he fought, bang, 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 bang. And when he got to that border and he heard Truman go, stop, he kind of went, no, a bang, a bang, a bang, bang, bang. And I don't know if you know what happens if you keep going that way, but eventually you bump your head on the, I almost said ass, on the butt of China. And millions of Chinese soldiers come out. And MacArthur was then pushed back across that line. I don't know which direction I'm walking in anymore, guys. But he was crossed back across the 38th. And that's where the war ended, at that 38th parallel. So one of the concepts on the test is, if you're the president, if you're the commander-in-chief, and your general one-ups you and says, no, what do you got to do? Donald Trump, you're fired! That's right, you got to trump him. And that's a question on the test, that you can't challenge the civilian command of the military. That it is the president, the suit and tie, or the woman in the blouse that decides these issues of where to fight, when to fight, and how to fight. So, in its day, this was very controversial. This would be like the most popular general in the United States getting canned. And he had aspirations to run for president. So nevertheless, you got to get Korea under your belt. We have 3 minutes to do, I guess, Cuban Missile Crisis. Wow, isn't that a shame? 3 minutes for an event like that. But here we go. In 1959, 1958, I'm going to get the year wrong, Cuba, the island of Cuba, 90 miles from Key West, went the color red. And that has a lot of historical roots with Che Guevara and Fidel Castro and even Simone Bolivar and philosophy and economic liberation. And there's all kinds of concepts up there. All I know is, containment. So when the island went red under Dwight Eisenhower, who very much believed in kind of this domino theory, we had to get him out. And we weren't willing to brinkmanship it in the sense of, pressing the red button or invading and provoking the Soviets. It was red, and once a country's red, it's hard to invade it, because then you're getting into the gang idea and jumping someone and starting a war. So the United States used the CIA to secretly plan an invasion of Cuba using Cuban exiles. Cubans who lived there and were part of the old government and now want their land back, right? So we train them secret, like all spy kind of stuff, and then JFK gets elected. I can imagine JFK walking into the Oval Office and being like, hi, I'm JFK, it's nice to meet you, I'm from Boston, I drive a car, and saying the CIA agent going, the plan is ready. Wow. It's a little bit green, and JFK agrees to this invasion. It's called the Bay of Pigs. And in 1960, maybe it's 61. It's got to be 61 because he was elected in November of 60. Okay. So in 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion is launched. Man, this does not go well, folks. In fact, they're met by the Cuban army, and they become, tortured and massacred, and they're getting shot at, and they grab their iPhones, and they're like, JFK, help! And JFK now has to either start World War III or let them cook. He lets them cook. Conspiracy theory, JFK alert, ouch. But the idea is this leads the Soviets to take action. And Cuban Missile Crisis in 45 seconds. Are you ready? They put missiles on the island of Cuba. Nuclear missiles 90 miles from us that will kill us. And maybe even destroy brinkmanship and mad if they can launch them before we can launch ours. We gotta get them off. JFK was told, invade, 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 invade. He refused. He negotiated an end by blockading the missiles. Cuba and eventually the missiles were withdrawn. If we did launch an attack, there were nuclear submarines outside the Atlantic Ocean, and there were missiles in Cuba ready to go. We would have all died. There's the idea of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Blockade, containment, we win. We never invade again. Castro's still there. Ouch.